Welcome to Philosophy 4, Knowledge. We are continuing our discussion of pragmatism. The next pragmatist philosopher we will discuss is C.I. Lewis. Lewis lived from 1883 to 1964. Like Carnap, who we will discuss next, Lewis was especially interested in advancing the ideas of pragmatism in relation to modern scientific ideas. Lewis starts out his essay by describing what knowledge looks like on his view of things. In his discussion, C.I. Lewis says that there are really three elements that go into knowledge. One element is just sense data. Sense data are just the basic images or sensory data that hit our perceptual system. Then there is knowledge that we might call relations of ideas. Relations of ideas, or pure conceptual elements, for C.I. Lewis, are just the abstract concepts that we use to interpret our sense data. This would include things like laws of physics, conceptual and mathematical schemas that we use to interpret the physical world, to laws of mathematics, which can be completely separated from anything in the physical or perceptual world. But he makes clear it also includes conceptual and theoretical elements, like ways of dividing what makes humans into humans, thinking about the concept of a body versus the concept of a soul. A key element of these relations of ideas, or these theoretical components, is that they can be fully understood even without any access to the sensory data. He even says that if we want to, we can think of this like the Platonic ideas, those ideas that just pre-exist before anyone finds them. He doesn't believe that they exist actually in a separate eternal realm, but he does believe that concepts just have interrelationships that can be understood in their abstract essence as the ways to understand things and classify the sense data that we experience. We can do math and geometry, and we can understand all of those conceptual relationships without applying it to the world, although we can apply it to the world when we use math, geometry, and algebra to send a spaceship to the moon. We can understand what we mean by something like body and soul before we apply it to the world to see if it really describes the world in which we live in an effective and efficient and productive way. So then, beyond those two elements of knowledge, there is the human interpreter. And what the human interpreter does in a pragmatic way is they look at the sensory data that they're getting from their senses. He uses William James' idea of a blooming, buzzing confusion, which is the world of our senses, before we apply concepts and ideas to make sense of it. Human perceivers take that sense data, and then they use the concepts of all the concepts that are available to us in the realm of possible ideas, possible ways of conceiving and theorizing the world, possible models to apply to that sense data. And we pick those conceptual elements which most effectively help to organize and make sense of the sense data that we are presented with. Now you might notice right away that this reminds us somewhat of the theory of Kant. You remember Kant wants to say there's the raw sense data of experience, and we can only make sense of that with certain necessary conceptual components that organize that sense data to make it a possible experience. Clearly, C.I. Lewis is getting some inspiration from that idea, but what he's getting rid of is the idea that there are only certain necessary concepts, and that those concepts are the only possible concepts which can be applied to the raw sense data of experience. You'll recall from our discussion of Kant that Kant believed that certain elements of Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics were just indispensable tools for experiencing the world. By the time of C.I. Lewis, Einstein is already on the scene, challenging the idea of Newtonian physics and giving alternate physics which are unintuitive but can still be used to understand how our world works and organize the data of our senses. And we have, for example, alternative geometries where parallel lines can in fact intersect themselves. So C.I. Lewis rejects the idea that experience is impossible without these essential ideas. He does seem to think that at least most experience is impossible without some ideas. But what those ideas are a matter of what works for us within our culture and within our time to interpret the world that we are presented with. But it's not just mathematical ideas. He talks about, for example, the ancient Greek idea of a soul, where a soul was something within us that actually led to growth and movement and had physical effects on us. Then he says how he sees the Christian notion changing this idea to a physical body which was on its own and an eternal soul which was separate from this. And that separating the idea from the soul, from the idea of the body, led to new ways of conceiving of what it means to be human and the experiences we have in the everyday world. So to sum this up, we might say that for C.I. Lewis, we have sense data. For Lewis, sense data isn't yet itself knowledge in the fullest sense. We have knowledge that's relations of ideas. That's those theoretical elements which make sense as ideas in their interrelations. And then all other truth is just pragmatic truth. What is the best theory to explain the experiences that we have? Which ideas do we choose to conceptualize and understand the experiences in the world? So we take our ideas and concepts and we employ those ones that work best to organize our direct experience. When a theory is useful for organizing our experiences and allowing us to act in the world, that theory should count as true and justified. One important implication of this for C.I. Lewis is the idea that truth is not digital. There's not just truth and falsity, but there's better and inferior truths according to how well things work. Some theories will be more true than other theories because they help us to organize the world better and they explain and predict more of our experience. Many things will also be false. Many theories will not organize the world at all or help us to predict anything in the world. Lewis gives the example of explanations for how the celestial bodies move around the earth. At the time of Ptolemy, it was believed that the best way to understand and predict the motions of planets was relative to the motions of the earth. And so very elaborate mathematical schemes were used to predict the motion of each body relative to the earth. With the onset of Copernicus, however, it was shown that the planets actually, including Earth, are all revolving around the sun, and so much simpler mathematics could be used to explain the motion of planets as well as many other things, using physical laws and the assumption that the Earth is the basis of gravity, which creates the motion of all those celestial bodies within our solar system. So you can see how Lewis might say, it's not that the earlier theory, with the Earth at the center and describing the patterns of the other planets, was inherently false. We could develop mathematics that would predict the trajectories of those planets. It's just that that mathematics is much less efficient and much less explanatory and much less useful than Copernican theories, where the sun is the center of the solar system, and Newtonian physics, which explains why the celestial bodies behave like they do. And then later, something similar actually happens to Newtonian physics as well. We realize that Newtonian physics works very well with things like planets in motion, and it works very well with things like baseballs moving across the baseball field when struck by a bat. But when looking at very small things like atoms and electrons, Newtonian physics no longer works to understand the behavior of those very small things. Now we could say, okay, quantum mechanics and atomic physics completely undoes the Newtonian story, and Newtonian physics, which said it describes the real world, is false. But what C.I. Lewis would say is, well, there was some truth to the Ptolemaic description of how celestial bodies worked. There was more truth to the Newtonian explanation, which described celestial bodies and balls moving in baseball parks. But there's also limitations to the application of that theory, and we may be able to use atomic physics to explain things that Newtonian physics could not. So multiple truths that explain the world in a multiplicity of ways can all be compatible for Lewis. It's not just a matter of dumping things into the that's worthless and false category, or that's completely true without limitation category. It's all about what works based on the goals that we have. Another important aspect of this for C.I. Lewis is that this also means that truth is relative. Truths are only true relative to what is useful for me, though there will be much regularity, and what is useful for my purposes is objective. So truth is relative because truth is always relative to some purpose. And you and I, as two different humans, might have at least somewhat different purposes. What matters to you and what matters to me will not be identical. But he shares in common with basically all the pragmatists that in general what works for us is only going to deviate so much. We all have the same basic physical constitution. We all have the same basic needs as human beings. In general, we all have a conscience and a desire to do right, and we want to find our place in this world. So there can be variations among us as to which truths work better for which people, and this might also vary from culture to culture, but we would be, for example, very unlikely to say, I'm going to throw out contemporary scientific ways of understanding the world because they do things like give us medicine, give us transportation through engineering, and make sense of our everyday world in a way that works for us and helps us achieve our goals. So even though our goals may vary somewhat, there will also be a lot of regularity there. A second point is just that what is useful for my purposes is objective. We talked about this a bit with William James, where I can't just say, well, the Ptolemaic geocentric view is more useful for me because I like it. It has to actually be useful for carrying out those purposes that matter to us as humans. And we saw this same basic idea with William James, right? Where he was willing to say, well, what works pragmatically in religious belief, for example, might be different from two people from different cultures, but the same idea of human flourishing is going to be at least constrained by similarities among all of us as humans. Chances are as well that as culture develops and human knowledge grows, that we hit on better and better theories that more effectively explain things for us. So I hope this gives you a sense of the philosophy of C.I. Lewis, some ways in which it's very similar to the pragmatism of William James, and also how it's influenced by the scientific perspectives that existed at his time.